July 11th, 1979, 2:30 in the afternoon. The Dadeland Mall in Miami. Family shopping, kids eating ice cream, the hum of air conditioning cutting through the Florida heat. Then two men walk into the Crown Liquor Store carrying Mac-10 submachine guns. In broad daylight, in a crowded shopping mall, they execute two men. The victims, according to the medical examiner, looked like Swiss cheese. The hitmen flee in what police would later discover was an armoured war wagon disguised as a party supply truck, bulletproof, stocked with enough weapons for a small war. A police officer at the scene coined a term that would define the next decade: cocaine cowboys. This wasn't a movie. This was Florida in the 1980s, a decade where $5 to $7 billion in drug money flowed through a single city, where 125,000 refugees arrived in 7 months, where communities erupted in the deadliest riots since the 1960s, and where a TV show somehow convinced the world that all of this was paradise. The 1980s in Florida began with the bloodiest riots since Detroit in 1967, and ended with a brand new NBA team taking the court in Miami Arena. In between, the Federal Reserve's Miami branch reported a cash surplus larger than all other Fed branches in the country combined. The murder rate hit 62 per 100,000 people, making Miami the nation's homicide capital. The medical examiner had to lease a refrigerated truck just to store the overflow of bodies. Over 700 people died of AIDS in tiny Key West alone. And through it all, Miami Vice convinced 30 million weekly viewers that this was the coolest place on earth. What you're about to hear isn't the Florida of travel brochures or nostalgic TV reruns. This is the unfiltered reality of a decade when paradise was manufactured while communities burned, when cocaine billions built downtown skylines, when refugees arrived seeking freedom only to face systematic discrimination, and when the line between the American dream and the American nightmare became impossible to find. We're going to follow the money, the staggering, impossible amounts of cash that transformed Miami's economy and skyline. We'll walk through the riots that tore communities apart after police violence went unpunished time and time again. We'll meet the refugees who arrived by boat, only to be labelled criminals in a propaganda campaign that persists to this day. We'll see how a plague swept through paradise while the government looked the away. And we'll discover how a television show managed to rebrand one of America's most violent cities into a symbol of glamour and cool that the world couldn't resist. This is Florida in the 1980s, not as you remember it, but as it actually was. Let's start with some numbers that don't make any sense. In 1981, the Federal Reserve Bank in Miami, just one branch in the nationwide system, reported a cash surplus of $5 to $7 billion. To understand what made this number impossible to explain through legitimate commerce, you need to know what was actually showing up. The surplus wasn't a mix of denominations like you'd see from normal retail business. It was almost exclusively $50 and $100 bills. Bricks of high-denomination currency arriving by the literal truckload. Every single other Federal Reserve branch in the entire United States was running a deficit, money flowing outward to meet normal consumer demand. That's how the system is designed to work. But in Miami, the flow had completely reversed. Banks couldn't process the physical cash fast enough, so they were shipping the excess back to the Federal Reserve in volumes that exceeded all other branches combined. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, none of them had a surplus, just Miami. An IRS special agent named Michael McDonald started documenting what was happening, and what he found was staggering. 12 people were depositing between $250 million and $500 million a year each in Miami banks. Each, not combined, each person was moving that much cash annually. One bank with only $37 million in assets somehow deposited $600 million in currency at the Fed in a single year. The expected deposits for a bank that size? 13 million. Economists at Florida International University did the math and concluded that at least 1/3 of Miami's entire economic output was derived from narcotics. Not 1%, not 5%. 1/3 of the whole economy was being powered by an illegal industry. By this point, Miami had become responsible for trafficking 70% of the cocaine entering the United States, 70% of the marijuana, and 90% of the counterfeit quaaludes. The Medellin cartel had transformed South Florida into America's primary drug gateway, and at peak operations, they were generating approximately $100 million daily in profits. The violence that came with this money was industrial in scale. The crisis actually started in 1980 during the Mariel Boatlift and the initial explosion of cocaine wars. The Dade County Medical Examiner's office couldn't handle the volume of bodies, so they had to lease a refrigerated truck from a rental company at $800 per month. Then came 1981, the deadliest year in Miami history, with 621 murders. The truck stayed in use through 1988, a 7-year period where murder became so routine that renting industrial refrigeration for corpses was just another line item in the county budget. Half of all murders were directly drug-related. Bodies turned up in gator-infested canals, stuffed in duffel bags along the turnpike, crammed into drums and shopping carts in marinas. In November 1981, Time magazine put Miami on its cover with the headline, "Paradise Lost?" The article declared the city plagued by an epidemic of violent crime, a plague of illicit drugs, and a tidal wave of refugees. But here's the thing people don't talk about. That plague of drugs wasn't destroying Miami's economy. It was building it. The woman who ran much of this operation was named Griselda Blanco. People called her the Godmother. Others called her Black Widow. At her peak, she was shipping nearly 2 tons of cocaine per month through Miami and reportedly making $80 million monthly. Let me put that in perspective. $80 million a month in 1980s money. That's over $250 million a month in today's dollars. Blanco is believed to be responsible for somewhere between 40 and 200 murders. The exact number will never be known because many bodies were never found, and many deaths were never connected to her network. She pioneered the motorcycle assassin technique. A hitman on the back of a motorcycle could weave through Miami traffic, pull up next to a target's car, execute them, and disappear before anyone could react. The casual brutality was shocking even by cartel standards. There's a story that captures just how far this violence had spread from any normal human boundaries. One of her targets was a man named Jesus Castro. Her assassin, Jorge Rivi Ayala, shot and killed Castro's 2-year-old son, Johnny, during a botched hit at a Miami shopping mall. When Blanco heard what happened, she reportedly said she was glad because killing the child would upset the father more. That's not cartel code. That's not even criminal logic. That's something else entirely. Then you had the smugglers. Mickey Monday and John Roberts partnered to move an estimated 60,000 pounds of cocaine between 1982 and 1986. They were paid $90 million in fees by the Medellin cartel for their services. Monday was a former marijuana smuggler who'd gone high-tech. He used radar jamming devices, night vision goggles, and drop beacons. He'd land planes full of cocaine on abandoned Nike missile bases on government property. The government had left these bases scattered across Florida after the Cold War, and they made perfect airstrips. Roberts was different. His father had been a capo regime in the Gambino crime family, so he grew up in that world. He understood how to build infrastructure. He created a 450-acre farm near Tampa with 2 runways and secret listening posts that monitored Coast Guard communications. When the Coast Guard radioed their positions, Roberts knew exactly where they were and could route his planes around them. Another pair, Willie Falcon and Sal Magluta, allegedly smuggled approximately $2 billion worth of cocaine from Colombia through the 1980s. Their money laundering operation was so sophisticated that Miami, banks were actually paying depositors to accept suitcases of cash while offering 20% CD yields that would be impossible in a legitimate economy. The center of this world was a place called the Mutiny Hotel at Sailboat Bay in Coconut Grove. The owner, a man named Burton Goldberg, created 130 individually themed rooms with names like Gypsy Caravan, Outer Space, and Hot Fudge. Drug traffickers conducted business in these rooms alongside celebrities like Liza Minnelli, Burt Reynolds, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Mutiny sold more Dom Perignon than any other venue in the world. Cocaine dealers wore bronzed McDonald's coffee stirrers around their necks. The little red straws were the perfect size for portioning out cocaine, so they became a kind of status symbol. When Brian De Palma was researching for the movie Scarface, he studied the Mutiny. Goldberg refused to let him film there, but the Babylon Club in the movie was modelled directly on it. And here's where this story gets really dark. The legitimate economy became completely inseparable from the drug money. A DEA agent named Al Coward said something that a lot of people didn't want to hear. I suspect the skyline of this town would change dramatically if there were no cocaine. He was right. While interest rates were soaring nationwide and real estate was crashing everywhere else, South Florida was the only market in the country where housing prices kept booming. 1/3 of all property transactions were all cash deals. Car dealers in Miami were transacting 6 times as much business in cash as their counterparts in Tampa, St. Petersburg, just a few hours north. One drug dealer bought $20 million in prime Miami real estate. Just one guy. That's how much money was floating around. Construction companies were building the towers on Brickell Avenue with money they knew came from cocaine, but nobody asked questions because the alternative was watching the city's economy collapse. In January 1982, President Reagan created the South Florida Task Force, headed by Vice President George H.W. Bush. The goal was to shut down the flow of drugs through Florida. By 1986, they'd made over 15,000 arrests. They'd seized more than £6 million of cannabis and 100,000 pounds of cocaine. Those are massive numbers. But here's the result. Cocaine imports into the United States actually increased by 10% during that time. A Government Accountability Office report concluded it was doubtful whether the task force can have any substantial long-term impact on drug availability. They were trying to drain an ocean with a bucket. For every load they seized, 10 more got through. The money kept flowing, the bodies kept piling up, and Miami kept building. To understand what happened in Miami in 1980, you need to understand what had been building for decades. The cocaine money was one part of the story. But there was another Miami, one that existed in neighborhoods like Liberty City and Overtown, where people watched cocaine billions flow through banks while their own communities crumbled. December 17th, 1979. Arthur McDuffie was 33 years old. He sold insurance for a living. He'd served in the Marines. He was a father to 2 daughters. He had no criminal record. That night he was riding his motorcycle through Miami when police officers noticed him allegedly pop a wheelie at a traffic light. What happened next would set Miami on fire. Multiple police cruisers chased McDuffie at high speeds through the streets. When he finally stopped at the intersection of North Miami Avenue and 38th Street, he surrendered. He got off his motorcycle and put his hands up. Then Miami police officers descended on him and beat him so severely that the medical examiner would later testify that McDuffie's skull was cracked like an egg. The force required to cause those fractures was equivalent to falling from a 4-story building and landing headfirst on concrete. But the officers didn't stop there. They knew what they'd done, so they staged a cover-up. They drove a police cruiser over McDuffie's motorcycle to make it look like he'd been in a crash. They broke the gauges on both sides of the gas tank. They took their service revolvers and shot at McDuffie's watch to create impact damage that would seem consistent with a crash. Then they wrote up false reports claiming McDuffie had lost control of his bike. The cover-up would have worked except for one officer named Charles Viverka. On Christmas Eve, troubled by the thought of McDuffie's orphaned children, Viverka confessed the truth. The investigation revealed that McDuffie had been beaten by officers wielding Cal-Lite flashlights, heavy-duty metal flashlights that officers sometimes used as clubs. Medical testimony would describe those flashlights being swung like an axe. 5 officers were charged with manslaughter and tampering with evidence. The trial was moved to Tampa, a more conservative, predominantly white city. The defense attorneys pulled their peremptory challenges and used them strategically. They removed every single black juror from the jury pool. On May 17, 1980, an all-white jury heard the case. The 5 accused officers had accumulated 47 citizen complaints, 13 internal affairs investigations, and 55 use-of-force reports between them. The evidence showed that McDuffie had been beaten to death while surrendering. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, not guilty on all charges. The verdict was announced at 2:30 in the afternoon. By 6 o'clock that evening, approximately 5,000 people had gathered at the Metro Justice Building in downtown Miami. Then the violence began. 3 white people, Michael Culp, 18 years old, his brother Jeffrey Culp, 22, and Deborah Getman, 23, had been fishing. They drove through the area completely unaware of the verdict. Their car was surrounded. They were dragged out and beaten to death in the street. Over the next 4 days, Miami burned. 18 people died, 10 black, 8 white. 11 African Americans were killed by police and National Guard forces. More than 800 people were injured. Over 1,100 were arrested. Property damage was estimated at $80 to $100 million. The violence spread across Liberty City, Overtown, Brownsville, and Coconut Grove. 3,600 Florida National Guard members were deployed to restore order. It was the deadliest urban riot in the United States since Detroit in 1967. But here's what the national news didn't explain. This wasn't spontaneous rage. This was the explosion of pressure that had been building for generations. The highways told the story better than any news report could. In the 1960s, when the interstate highway system was being built through American cities, Miami made a choice. Interstate 95 and Interstate 395 were deliberately routed directly through the heart of Overtown, the center of Black Miami. The neighborhood that locals called Little Broadway was demolished. This was where Aretha Franklin had performed, where Sam Cooke had stayed, where Ella Fitzgerald sang, where Muhammad Ali had trained. Black-owned businesses, hotels, nightclubs, all bulldozed to make room for highways. The population of Overtown collapsed from approximately 40,000 people to under 8,000. The displaced residents crowded into Liberty City, which had been built in the 1930s as segregated public housing. Physical concrete walls, actual walls, had been constructed in 1939 and 1940 to block Liberty City from white view. Those walls were still standing in 1980. By 1980, the median income in Overtown, Liberty City, and parts of Coconut Grove was $5,500 per year. The federal poverty threshold at the time was higher than that. Unemployment in Overtown reached 50%. The public housing that had been built for black residents displaced by highway construction was, according to historian Dr. Marvin Dunn, as if someone sat down and figured out the worst possible housing at the cheapest cost. It was stacking poor people on top of each other. And the McDuffie beating wasn't an isolated incident. In the 1970s, there had been no fewer than 12 mini riots in Miami, all stemming from police confrontations with black residents. A state trooper had sexually assaulted a 9-year-old black girl. He was never punished. Police had burst into the wrong home during a drug raid and beaten a schoolteacher named Nathaniel LaFleur, his wife and his son. No consequences. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission investigated after the riots and concluded that the violence stemmed from the systematic exclusion of black Miami from the city's economic mainstream and neglect in housing, jobs, education, and criminal justice. But even after the worst riot in a generation, nothing really changed. On December 28, 1982, just 2.5 years later, a Miami police officer named Luis Alvarez shot and killed a 20-year-old black man named Neville Johnson Jr. in the face. Johnson had been playing an Eagle video game at an Overtown arcade. Alvarez was Cuban-born, just 18 months on the force, and he'd already accumulated 8 citizen complaints in that short time. 3 days of rioting followed. 2 people died. 26 to 37 were injured, depending on which reports you read. When Alvarez went to trial in 1984, he faced another all-white jury. This despite the fact that 20% of Dade County voters were registered as black. The jury acquitted him in 2 hours. Then it happened again. January 16, 1989, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Officer William Lozano shot Clement Anthony Lloyd in the head as Lloyd rode a motorcycle through Overtown. 5 witnesses testified that Lozano deliberately stepped into the street, crouched, then kind of tiptoed out into the street while holding his pistol with both hands. Lloyd died at the scene. His passenger, Alan Blanchard, died the next day from injuries sustained in the crash that followed. Lloyd's body lay on the ground for more than 2 hours before it was removed, a detail that residents would remember as a deliberate show of disrespect. The 1989 riots occurred within a week of Super Bowl 23, which was scheduled to be held in Miami. There were serious fears the game would have to be moved to Tampa. Unlike the previous riots, no one was killed during the violence itself, but 13 businesses burned. Lozano was initially convicted. He became the first Florida law enforcement officer sentenced for an on-duty shooting, but his conviction was overturned on appeal, and he was acquitted in a 1993 retrial held in Orlando. 3 major riots in 9 years, all sparked by police violence against black residents, all followed by acquittals or minimal consequences. The pattern was so consistent it seemed almost designed to provoke. Meanwhile, the Cuban refugee community, many of whom arrived during the Mariel Boatlift that same year as the Liberty City riots, were receiving substantial federal assistance. 75% of Cuban arrivals before 1974 received government help. Some were even employed by the CIA. By 1982, Hispanic Americans held 3 of the 5 Miami City Commission seats, including the mayor. Only 1 African American served on the commission. Black residents watched newcomers receive aid they'd never been offered while their own. Neighborhoods remained under-resourced and over-policed. The Florida legislature, when discussing aid for Liberty City after the riots, framed it as rewarding rioters, leaving the neighborhood economically scarred for decades. This was the other Miami, the one that didn't appear in the tourism brochures or on Miami Vice. The one where justice was a luxury that only some people could afford. While Miami was still recovering from the Liberty City riots, another crisis was unfolding 90 miles south. April 4th, 1980. A bus carrying 6 Cuban citizens crashed through the gates of Peru's embassy in Havana. They were seeking political asylum. Within 2 days, over 10,000 Cubans had flooded onto the small embassy grounds. The Cuban government had removed its guards, effectively opening the floodgates. People climbed the walls, squeezed through the gates, desperate to escape. Fidel Castro saw an opportunity. On April 20th, he announced that the port of Mariel was open to anyone who wished to leave Cuba, provided someone came from the United States to pick them up. This created an impossible situation for Cuban Americans in Florida. If you had family in Cuba, you could suddenly rescue them after decades of separation. But there was a catch. When Cuban Americans arrived in Mariel Harbor in their boats, Cuban officials forced them to load strangers onto their vessels. Castro was deliberately emptying his jails and mental institutions into the Boatlift. He called the departing Cubans escoria, scum, and gusanos, worms. The propaganda was explicit. These weren't political refugees. These were criminals and anti-socialists that Cuba was dumping on America's shores. Between April 15th and October 31st, 1980, 125,266 Cubans arrived in Florida. Most came aboard approximately 1,700 boats organized by Cuban Americans. In May alone, the peak month, 86,488 refugees arrived. That's 69% of the total, all in a single month. The Mariel Boatlift increased Miami's labor force by 7%, and the Cuban working population by 20% almost overnight. The myth about these refugees was established immediately, and it has persisted for over 40 years. The opening crawl of the movie Scarface claimed that 1 in 5 Marielitos were criminals. The Washington Post estimated 17%. Police bulletins guessed 40,000 criminals had arrived. An INS official told People magazine the number was 85%. Politicians repeated these numbers. The media amplified them. And they were all wildly, catastrophically wrong. The actual documented reality is this. 2.2%, that's 2,746 people out of 125,000, were classified as serious or violent criminals under US law. Academic studies found approximately 4% had any criminal records, and many of those were imprisoned in Cuba for political reasons, for being openly gay, for practicing religion, for listening to American music, for selling goods on the black market. The most comprehensive research by the Migration Policy Institute concluded that less than 2% were common criminals. Professor Jose Manuel Garcia of Florida Southern College, who is himself a Mariel refugee, states plainly, the percentage of criminals was very minimal. Most of this was propaganda from both the US and Cuban governments. Time magazine itself would later acknowledge, more than 80% of the Marielitos had no criminal past, even in a nation where criminality could include acts antithetical to the revolutionary government's ideals. Yes, Castro did deliberately include some prisoners and mentally ill people, approximately 1,500 disabled individuals and perhaps 5,000 with previous felony records. About 2,000 were eventually deported, 3,000 stayed. But these numbers are nowhere near the myth that was created. The overwhelming majority of Marielitos were ordinary Cubans who wanted to leave. What the statistics also obscure is who these criminals actually were. Many Cuban criminals had been imprisoned for public homosexuality, which was classified as dangerous behavior under Cuban law. Others were imprisoned for religious belief or political dissent. Castro specifically targeted Afro-Cubans to be included in the Boatlift. Approximately 20% of Marielitos were black or mulatto, compared to just 7% of the Cuban immigrants who'd arrived in the 1960s. This was a deliberate strategy to create racial tension in the United States. The processing of these refugees revealed the deep racial and geopolitical double standards that defined American immigration policy. While Cuban arrivals were generally classified as entrants with pending status and released to family sponsors, Haitian refugees arriving at the same time were categorically labelled as economic migrants rather than political refugees. This classification stripped them of asylum protections. The epicenter of this discriminatory policy was the Chrome Service Processing Center. Originally an abandoned Army missile base on the edge of the Everglades, Chrome had been converted in 1979 into a detention facility. By 1980, it had become a symbol of indefinite detention. While white Cuban Marielitos were released quickly to family sponsors, black Marielitos faced prolonged detention. The statistics tell the story. By January 1981, 73% of remaining detainees at facilities nationwide were black or mulatto. By summer 1981, 95% were black men. White Marielitos went home. Black Marielitos stayed in detention. Conditions at Chrome were deplorable. In 1981, overcrowding forced hundreds of men to sleep in open fields. Reports of physical abuse, lack of legal counsel, and isolation were common. Hunger strikes and uprisings became regular occurrences. Detainees were protesting their treatment in a facility that was supposed to be temporary but had become a long-term prison for people who'd committed no crime. Meanwhile, Haitian refugees faced even worse treatment. Approximately 25,000 Haitians arrived in South Florida during this same period, fleeing the brutal dictatorship of Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier. But because Haiti wasn't a communist country and the US supported Duvalier's regime, Haitians couldn't claim they were fleeing political persecution. They were labelled economic migrants and subjected to a policy of deterrence designed to discourage future arrivals. At Chrome, overcrowding reached crisis levels. The facility was designed for 600 people but held up to 1,600 at times. While Cubans were processed at military bases like Eglin Air Force Base with faster turnover, Haitians were held indefinitely at Chrome. In 1981, the US implemented an interdiction agreement allowing the Coast Guard to return Haitians at sea before they could claim asylum. This policy effectively closed the door to Haitian refugees while keeping it open for Cubans. The processing camps became chaotic scenes. The Miami Orange Bowl was converted into a temporary shelter. Decommissioned Nike missile sites across Florida housed refugees. Fort Chaffee in Arkansas became one of the main processing centers, but riots erupted there when detainees realized they weren't being released. The violence at Fort Chaffee became a major news story and contributed to Bill Clinton's defeat in his 1980 gubernatorial re-election campaign in Arkansas. His opponent ran footage of the riots in campaign ads. But here's what happened over the long term once the propaganda faded and the actual integration occurred. Economist David Card conducted a seminal study on the Mariel Boatlift's impact on Miami's labor market. He found that despite the sudden 7% increase in the workforce, there was no significant depression of wages for native workers. Miami's economy absorbed the influx. By 2020, researcher Jose Manuel Garcia could document that over half of the Mariel refugees had made it into the middle class. The Marielitos became business owners, authors, musicians, doctors, and teachers. They sparked a recognized literary movement called La Generación del Mariel. Their children and grandchildren are now fully integrated into American society. The criminal element that was supposed to destroy Miami? It never materialized on the scale that was predicted. The vast majority of Marielitos lived quiet, law-abiding lives. They worked hard, raised families, and contributed to their communities. But the myth persists. When people think of the Mariel, Boatlift, they think of Scarface. They think of criminals flooding into Florida. The propaganda worked so well that 45 years later, it's still the dominant narrative. The truth, that ordinary people fled tyranny, that they integrated successfully, that the criminal element was minimal, doesn't get repeated nearly as often. This matters because it shaped how America thought about refugees for an entire generation. The Mariel myth has been used to justify restrictive immigration policies ever since. It's been invoked in debates about Syrian refugees, Central American asylum seekers, and every subsequent refugee crisis. The lie became more powerful than the truth. While drug violence and refugee crises dominated the headlines, another crisis was unfolding quietly, one that would kill thousands and fundamentally change entire communities. By 1989, Florida ranked third in the nation for cumulative AIDS cases, with approximately 8,000 documented infections. Only New York and California had more. But the way AIDS spread through Florida was different, and the communities it devastated were unique. Key West, a tiny island of 25,000 residents at the southern tip of Florida, lost over 700 people to AIDS during the decade. That's nearly 3% of the entire population. Imagine a disease killing 1 out of every 35 people in your town. The Key West AIDS Memorial at White Street Pier, built in 1997, bears over 1,000 names. In 1983, Key West had elected Richard A. Hayman as mayor, the first openly gay mayor in United States history. The gay community had revitalized Key West's economy in the mid-1970s. Before they arrived, residents recalled, "You could drive down Duval Street and just about every fourth shop had a sign saying it was out of business." Gay business owners refurbished the distinctive gingerbread-trimmed houses and opened shops and restaurants. The Key West Business Guild, founded in 1978, was one of America's first LGBTQ chambers of commerce. Then AIDS arrived, and doctors like Jerome Covington and Mark Whiteside found themselves on the front lines of a plague, watching their friends and neighbors die while the federal government offered minimal help. The Reagan administration's response to AIDS was characterized by years of silence. Reagan didn't publicly mention AIDS until 1985, 4 years into the epidemic. His press secretary, Larry Speakes, made jokes about gay plague during press briefings. But Key West wasn't the only community devastated by AIDS in Florida. Belle Glade, a small agricultural town of 20,000 residents in Palm Beach County, recorded AIDS rates that rivaled San Francisco's by the mid-80s. By 1986, the cumulative incidence reached 295 cases per 100,000 people, compared to San Francisco's 316. By 1988, Belle Glade hit 806 per 100,000. What made Belle Glade unusual was that half of the AIDS cases couldn't be placed in the traditional risk categories that public health officials had identified. The CDC sent researchers to investigate, and wild theories emerged. Some speculated about mosquito transmission, creating panic that AIDS could spread through insects. The research eventually debunked these theories, but the damage to Belle Glade's reputation was done. The real drivers in Belle Glade were poverty, prostitution, crack cocaine use, and untreated sexually transmitted diseases that made HIV transmission more likely. Belle Glade had a significant Haitian population, 11.5%, and Haitians faced a particularly cruel stigma during the AIDS epidemic. Early in the crisis, the CDC and media created what became known as the 4 H's, the group supposedly at highest risk: homosexuals, haemophiliacs, heroin users, and Haitians. An entire nationality was branded as disease vectors. Haitian Americans faced discrimination in employment, housing, and healthcare. Haitian-owned businesses lost customers. Haitian children were bullied in schools. In April 1985, after sustained protests from the Haitian community, the CDC removed Haitians from the official risk group list. But the damage had been done. The stigma persisted for years. Haitians in South Florida, already facing discrimination from their refugee status and the government's classification of them as economic migrants rather than political refugees, now carried the additional burden of being associated with AIDS. Then there's the story of the Ray brothers in Arcadia, Florida. Arcadia was a small town of about 6,500 people in central Florida. In 1986, 3 haemophiliac brothers, Ricky, age 9, Robert, age 8, and Randy, age 7, were diagnosed as HIV positive. They'd contracted the virus from contaminated blood products used to treat their haemophilia. The school board barred them from attending classes. When a federal court ordered the school to admit them in June 1987, the community responded with death threats, bomb threats, and a 50% school boycott. The Ray family was expelled from their church. Friends abandoned them. People they'd known for years crossed the street to avoid them. On August 28, 1987, someone set fire to the Ray family's home while they were sheltering elsewhere. The house burned to the ground. The arsonist was never caught. The Ray family fled to Sarasota, where they were finally welcomed by a more accepting community. Ricky Ray died in December 1992 at age 15. Before his death, he'd written letters to Presidents Reagan and Bush pleading for help for people like him who'd contracted HIV through no fault of their own. In 1998, President Clinton signed the Ricky Ray Hemophilia Relief Fund Act, which allocated $750 million for hemophiliacs who'd contracted HIV from contaminated blood products. It came too late for Ricky, but it helped thousands of others. The Ray brothers' story became national news, but they were far from the only ones facing discrimination. Throughout Florida, people with AIDS lost jobs, were evicted from apartments, were refused service at restaurants and hospitals. Funeral homes wouldn't handle their bodies. Families held secret memorial services to avoid stigma. Florida finally passed the Omnibus AIDS Act in 1988, which prohibited discrimination in employment, housing, public services, and insurance. But the law came late, after thousands had already died amid stigma and neglect, and even after the law passed, enforcement was weak and discrimination continued. What's often forgotten is how the AIDS crisis created lasting community organizations that would prove resilient for decades. The Gay Men's Health Crisis chapters in Florida provided support services, education, and advocacy. The Names Project AIDS memorial quilt documented lives lost. Activists who cut their teeth fighting for AIDS funding and awareness in the 1980s became the foundation of LGBTQ rights movements that would achieve marriage equality decades later. But in the moment in the 1980s, it felt like plague. Communities watched their friends disappear one by one. Memorial services became weekly occurrences. Young, healthy people would get sick and be dead within months. The terror of not knowing who would be next, the exhaustion of caring for the dying, the rage at a government that seemed indifferent, all of this defined an entire generation. The AIDS crisis in Florida wasn't just about gay men in Key West or haemophiliacs in Arcadia. It cut across every community: gay, straight, black, white, Latino, Haitian. It revealed both the worst of human prejudice and the best of human compassion, and it killed over 10,000 Floridians during the decade, leaving scars on communities that are still healing. September 16th, 1984. NBC premiered a new show called Miami Vice, and American popular culture shifted overnight. The show's creator, Anthony Yerkovich, had conceived the idea after reading a Wall Street Journal article about how 1/3 of unreported US income was flowing through South Florida. Executive producer Michael Mann took that concept and issued a directive that would define the aesthetic of the entire decade. No earth tones. The show cost approximately $1.3 million per episode, 30% higher than typical police dramas at the time. And it looked unlike anything television had produced before. People magazine called it the first show to look really new and different since color TV was invented. Within a year, it won 4 Emmy Awards and 2 People's Choice Awards. Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas appeared on the covers of both Time and Rolling Stone in 1985. But Miami Vice didn't just film in Miami, it reconstructed the city's entire image. When the production crew arrived in South Beach, the Art Deco district was essentially a slum. The once glamorous hotels had deteriorated into cheap housing for impoverished elderly retirees living on Social Security. People called it God's waiting room. The buildings were painted in drab colours or left unpainted, their distinctive architecture crumbling from decades of neglect and salt air. The show's producers literally painted the city. They chose buildings with interesting architecture, had them painted in vibrant pastels, turquoise, pink, peach, mint green, and used them as backdrops for scenes. They didn't just film Miami as it existed, they created a visual aesthetic and then filmed that. The South Beach look that's now recognised worldwide didn't exist before Miami Vice. The show invented it. The fashion influence was immediate and global. Ray-Ban sales jumped to 720,000 units in 1984, directly attributed to Don Johnson wearing their Wayfarer sunglasses. Weil created something called the stubble device, specifically for achieving Crockett's 3-day beard look. After Six produced Miami Vice dinner jackets, Kenneth Cole introduced Crockett and Tubbs shoes. Macy's department store opened a dedicated Miami Vice section. Costume designer Jody Tillen observed, "It changed the way men dressed in the world. It gave men permission to wear pastels." The look, unstructured Armani jackets worn over t-shirts, Italian loafers without socks, rolled sleeves, pastel colours, became the visual shorthand for 80s cool. You can still see its influence in fashion today. But the show's more significant achievement was rebranding Miami itself. Remember, in 1981, Time magazine had declared Miami plagued by epidemic crime and drugs. The Miami Herald was distributing bumper stickers that read, "Come back to Miami, we weren't shooting at you." The city's national image was violence, cocaine, and chaos. Within a year of Miami Vice's premiere, the Miami Herald noted, "The national perception of Miami has markedly changed. Crime and drugs and refugees have been overwhelmed by visions of fast Porsches and neon nightclubs." The show contributed an estimated $1 million per episode to Miami's economy through location fees, local hiring, and tourism increases. International tourists started booking trips specifically because of the show. South Beach, which had been on the verge of demolition, developers wanted to tear down the Art Deco buildings and replace them with modern high-rises, suddenly attracted preservation interest. The Miami Design Preservation League gained momentum. Ordinances were passed protecting historic buildings. Leonard Horowitz, a designer who'd worked on the preservation efforts, applied the same pastel color palette to more buildings throughout the district. What had started as a TV production choice became the neighborhood's actual aesthetic. Developers saw the potential. Real estate prices began climbing. The elderly retirees on fixed incomes were gradually displaced by restaurants, bars, clubs, and eventually luxury condos. As one producer noted, the producers of Miami Vice had pulled off the Florida dream. They told a lie that came true. The show's portrayal of the drug war was sanitized, glamorized, stylized. Yes, Crockett and Tubbs were cops fighting drug dealers, but the violence was choreographed, the lifestyle was aspirational, and the city looked like paradise. The refrigerated trucks full of bodies at the medical examiner's office. Not in Miami Vice. The Liberty City riots, never mentioned. The AIDS crisis, not part of the narrative. The show took the darkest period in Miami's modern history and turned it into the coolest aesthetic in American pop culture. And it worked. People wanted to be in Miami because of Miami Vice, even though the real Miami was still dealing with murder rates that made it the most dangerous city in America. The cognitive dissonance was complete. Reality and image had become completely separated. Meanwhile, Florida was generating its own music that would influence culture for decades. Gloria Estefan and Miami Sound Machine broke through in 1985 with Conga, the first song to simultaneously chart on pop, dance, Latin, and R&B charts. In 1988, during the Calle Ocho Festival, they created the world's largest conga line, 120,000 people dancing through the streets of Little Havana. From the black neighborhoods of Liberty City, Gould's, and Overtown came Miami bass, a new genre built on heavy bass, drum machines, and sexually explicit lyrics. Luther Campbell and Two Live Crew created the template with Throw the D in 1986. Their album, As Nasty as They Wanna Be, sold over 2 million copies in 1989, but became the first album in American history to be declared legally obscene by a Florida court. Group members were arrested for performing songs from the album at an adults-only show. The resulting legal battles went all the way to the Supreme Court. The 1994 case, Campbell v. Acuff Rose Music, Inc., became a landmark ruling on parody and fair use that would influence copyright law for decades. So Miami Vice gave the world a sanitized, glamorous vision of Miami, while Miami Bass gave them the raw, uncensored reality from the streets. And somehow both became iconic representations of Florida in the 80s. Two completely different truths existing simultaneously. If you were a tourist watching Miami Vice or reading travel brochures, you might think Florida in the 1980s was a single unified place. It wasn't. Depending on who you were and where you lived, Florida might as well have been different countries. Florida's population exploded from 9.7 million to 12.9 million during the decade, a 33% increase that made it the fourth most populous state. But that growth wasn't evenly distributed, and the communities that formed were radically different from each other. In Miami, the demographic transformation was total. The English-speaking white population collapsed from 84% in 1950 to just 12% by 1990. By the end of the decade, 59.2% of Miami-Dade residents spoke Spanish at home. Miami had become a Latin American city that happened to be located in the United States. Little Havana, centered on Calle Ocho, 8th Street, became the heart of Cuban Miami. Versailles Restaurant, which opened in 1971, became known as the most famous Cuban restaurant in the world. But it was more than a restaurant. It was a community center, a political gathering place, the spot where exile politics were debated over Café Cubano. The Ventanita culture defined daily life, walk-up windows where you could order a thimble-sized cup of incredibly strong Cuban coffee without ever going inside. These little windows became social hubs. People would stop by multiple times a day, standing on the sidewalk, talking politics and gossip while drinking coffee that could wake the dead. Cuban cuisine became Miami cuisine. Lechon asado, roast pork marinated in mojo, ropa vieja, shredded beef in tomato sauce, yuca con mojo, tostones, and the Cuban sandwich, which sparked endless debates about the proper construction. Did it include salami or not? Miami said no, Tampa said yes, and neither side would compromise. Meanwhile, Little Haiti emerged in the former Lemon City area, named by activist Vita Juste, who fought to give the community an identity. The colourful storefronts, botanicas selling herbs and religious items for Vodou practices, and the sound of Haitian Creole on the streets created a distinct Caribbean atmosphere. But the Haitian community faced challenges the Cubans didn't. They'd been classified as economic migrants rather than political refugees, which meant no government assistance, constant deportation threats, and the added burden of the AIDS stigma. South Florida's Jewish community remained substantial throughout the decade. Broward County alone had 174,000 Jews by 1980, one-third of the regional total. Century Village communities in Boca Raton, Deerfield Beach and West Palm Beach housed thousands of retirees from the Northeast. Miami Beach had been 80% Jewish by the 1970s and included a significant population of Holocaust survivors. The area's synagogues and Jewish community centres were vital institutions. The mall became essential social infrastructure in the subtropical heat. Air-conditioned enclosed shopping centres weren't just about retail. They were where people went to walk, socialise, and escape the humidity. Dadeland Mall, despite being the site of the cocaine Cowboys Massacre in '79, remained Florida's most successful shopping centre by dollar volume, averaging $560 per square foot in 1991 sales. That was twice the national average. Aventura Mall opened in 1983 and became Florida's largest at 2.7 million square feet. The Florida Mall opened in 1986. Sawgrass Mills opened in 1990. These weren't just places to shop, they were the new town squares, the places where teenagers hung out, where families spent weekends, where the air conditioning made the Florida summer bearable. But if you travelled just a few hours north to Tampa, you found a completely different Florida. Tampa grew only 3% during the decade. The city annexed New Tampa's 24 square miles in 1988, but the core city was stagnant. Ybor City, once the cigar capital of the world, sat in a state of disrepair by the early 80s. The gorgeous brick streets were vacant and boarded up. Then artists seeking cheap studio space began converting storefronts. The neighbourhood became both an artist haven and what locals called a queer district before its 1988 designation as a community redevelopment area launched its transformation into an entertainment district. Orlando exploded with theme park expansion. Epcot Center opened on October 1st, 1982. The cost, somewhere between $800 million and $1.4 billion, made it the largest private construction project on Earth at the time. Within 5 years, attendance reached 26 million annually. Disney MGM Studios opened May 1st, 1989. The parks effectively doubled tourism at Walt Disney World, triggering explosive growth throughout the Orlando metro area. The city that had been a quiet citrus center became a global destination. Jacksonville maintained its character as a Navy town. Naval Air Station Jacksonville employed over 21,000 people. Naval Station Mayport housed the third largest naval surface fleet concentration in the country. NAS Cecil Field was the Navy's largest master jet base. The city was culturally more connected to the Deep South than to South Florida. It was conservative, military-focused, and largely bypassed by the drug trafficking that consumed Miami. The Panhandle was other Florida, culturally southern, economically dependent on massive military installations. Neyes, Pensacola was the cradle of naval aviation, where Navy pilots trained. Eglin Air Force Base was the largest Air Force base in the world at 724 square miles. Hurlburt Field specialized in special operations. The economy ran on military contracts and the personnel stationed at these bases. And then there was Key West, 8 square miles at the end of a chain of islands, 25,000 residents, hosting over 1 million tourists annually while living through what local police called the darkest years in the department's history. In 1985, members of both the police and fire departments were indicted on federal drug charges. The island earned the nickname Smuggler's Island. The transition from marijuana to cocaine proved deadly even in Key West. As one resident put it, happy-go-lucky pot smuggling of the 60s gave way to deadly cocaine cowboys of the 80s. Fishermen could earn $100,000 for a single cocaine smuggling run versus $17,000 annually fishing legally. Bales of marijuana, square grouper, locals called them, washed up regularly on beaches. People would just take them home. But Key West is also where one of the strangest protests in American history occurred. On April 23, 1982, the U.S. Border Patrol established a roadblock on U.S. Highway 1, the only road connecting the Keys to the mainland. They were checking for illegal immigrants and drugs. The roadblock created 17-mile traffic jams. Mayor Dennis Wardlow had had enough. He declared Key West's secession from the United States as the Conch Republic. In a ceremony at Mallory Square, he symbolically attacked a man in a naval uniform with stale Cuban bread, then immediately surrendered and demanded $1 billion in foreign aid. The roadblock was quietly removed within days. But the Conch Republic secession became an annual tourism draw, with T-shirts, flags, and a whole mythology around Key West's independence. So what did daily life actually look like in Florida in the 1980s? It depended entirely on who you were and where you lived. A Cuban refugee in Little Havana building a successful business. A black resident of Liberty City watching his neighborhood remain neglected while resources flowed elsewhere. A Jewish retiree in Century Village playing cards in the air-conditioned clubhouse. A gay man in Key West watching his friends die while the government remained silent. A military family in Pensacola living on base. An artist squatting in an abandoned cigar factory in Ybor City. These weren't just different experiences of the same Florida. They were different Floridas entirely, existing in parallel realities separated by miles, economics, race, and opportunity. While humans were remaking Florida through violence, migration, and cultural transformation, nature was waging its own war against what the state had become. Governor Bob Graham, who served from 1979 to 1987, navigated the state through the Mariel Boatlift, the Miami Riots, and the cocaine epidemic, but he also pioneered environmental protection in ways that would shape Florida for decades. His famous work days had him working full shifts as a railroad engineer, policeman, construction worker, and dozens of other jobs, over 400 workdays total. It was partly political theatre, but it gave him genuine insight into working-class Florida. He created Save Our Rivers in 1982, Save Our Coasts, and Save Our Everglades programs. The 1984 Wetlands Protection Act was landmark legislation for its time. He co-founded the Save the Manatee Club with singer Jimmy Buffett. When he left office, his approval rating was 83%, almost unheard of for a politician. But even Graham's efforts couldn't stop the damage being done to Florida's ecosystems. The Everglades were dying. water phosphorus levels reached 500 parts per billion in the 1980s. To understand how catastrophic this is, natural levels are between 4 and 10 parts per billion. The phosphorus was coming from agricultural runoff from the Everglades agricultural area south of Lake Okeechobee, specifically from the massive sugarcane operations. The sugar industry, Big Sugar, held enormous political power in Florida. They successfully lobbied against strict water quality regulations throughout the decade. The burden of cleanup was shifted to taxpayers rather than the industry causing the pollution. Mercury was first discovered in Everglades fish during the 80s. By the end of the decade, more than half of the original Everglades had been destroyed. Only about 2% remained truly intact. The fiercest defender of the Everglades was a woman named Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She'd written The Everglades River of Grass in 1947, and in 1969, at age 79, she founded Friends of the Everglades. By 1980, the organization had 4,000 members across 8 counties. She fought Big Sugar and the Army Corps of Engineers throughout the decade. At a 1983 hearing, when the sugar industry representatives booed her testimony, she responded, "Can't you boo any louder than that?" She was 93 years old and not intimidated in the slightest. Graham launched Save Our Everglades in 1983, the first comprehensive attempt to restore the Kissimmee River Lake Okeechobee Everglades system. The goal was to restore the ecosystem by the year 2000. That didn't happen. The restoration is still ongoing today, but it established the framework for federal-state cooperation and land acquisition that continues. Meanwhile, Central Florida was experiencing environmental catastrophe of a different kind. For over a century, citrus had been the cultural and economic heart of the state. The industry centered on the Ridge, the high ground running through Lake, Orange, and Polk counties. Then the 1980s destroyed it. Severe freezes hit in 1981, 1982, 1983, 1985, and 1989. The freeze of the century in January 1985 was particularly catastrophic. Temperatures dropped into the teens across Central Florida. Approximately 1/3 of the state's commercial citrus trees were killed. Entire groves that had been in families for generations were wiped out in a single night. Then, as if the weather wasn't enough, citrus canker broke out in 1984. This bacterial disease is highly contagious among citrus trees. The state's eradication program was brutal. They burned millions of nursery trees and destroyed any groves within proximity to infected plants. The idea was to create a firebreak of dead trees to stop the spread. It worked in some areas but not others, and it further decimated an industry already reeling from the freezes. Grove owners faced bankruptcy. The land that had produced oranges for 100 years was suddenly worthless for agriculture, so they sold to developers. The suburban sprawl of Central Florida that you see today, the endless housing developments and strip malls spreading across former grove land, that's the direct result of the citrus collapse in the 1980s. The industry tried to move south to the warmer climates of southwest Florida below Lake Okeechobee, but the total acreage never recovered. The Ridge, the historic heart of Florida citrus, was abandoned. Those old packing houses and processing plants either became historical curiosities or were demolished. And here's a strange detail about the decade. Despite all the environmental degradation, despite the sugar industry choking the Everglades and the citrus freezes destroying Central Florida, the 1980s were remarkably hurricane-free for the peninsula and major population centers. While Hurricanes Elena and Kate did strike the Panhandle in 1985, no major hurricane made direct landfall on the Florida peninsula during the entire decade. Miami, Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, all the major cities were spared. This created dangerous complacency. People forgot how vulnerable Florida really was. Development accelerated in coastal areas that should never have been built up. Then Hurricane Andrew hit in 1992 and reminded everyone what a major hurricane could do. Bob Martinez replaced Graham as governor in 1987. He was Florida's first Hispanic governor and second Republican since Reconstruction. He created Preservation 2000, the largest conservation land purchasing initiative in the nation at the time. But he's also remembered for an unpopular services tax that was quickly repealed, and for an anti-obscenity campaign that specifically targeted Two Live Crew, making him seem out of touch with cultural changes. He lost his 1990 re-election bid to Lawton Chiles, the last Florida governor to lose re-election. George H.W. Bush then appointed Martinez as the nation's drug czar, which, given Florida's role in the hash cocaine trade, had a certain irony to it. The environmental battles of the 1980s set the template for conflicts that continue today. The Everglades restoration remains incomplete. The sugar industry still wields enormous political power. Development continues to encroach on wetlands and natural areas. The lessons that should have been learned in the 80s, that you can't treat Florida's ecosystems as infinite resources to be exploited, still haven't fully taken hold. But what the decade did establish was a framework for conservation. The land acquisition programs that Graham and Martinez created have protected millions of acres. The Everglades restoration, however slowly it proceeds, is the largest environmental restoration project in history. And activists like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas proved that determined citizens could fight powerful industries and sometimes win, or at least slow them down long enough for attitudes to change. The unlimited cash flooding through Florida didn't just corrupt the economy and legitimate businesses, it corrupted the people who were supposed to stop it. The Miami River cop scandal remains one of the most significant cases of police corruption in United States history. It started with a police department desperately trying to expand. In 1981 and 82, the Miami Police Department went on what officials later called a virtual hiring frenzy. They more than doubled the size of the force, and to do it quickly, they dramatically lowered screening standards. The goal was to combat the rising crime rate and meet affirmative action requirements. The result was that hundreds of people became Miami police officers who never should have been given badges and guns. Many had questionable backgrounds. Some had failed polygraph tests, but were hired anyway. The training was rushed, the supervision was inadequate. And then these officers discovered that drug dealers were carrying more cash than the police department could ever pay them. The Miami River cops operated as a criminal enterprise. They didn't arrest drug traffickers, they robbed them. Officers would stop load vehicles carrying cocaine and cash, seize everything, then either let the traffickers go or kill them. They'd use their police authority to raid stash houses, stealing hundreds of kilograms of cocaine to resell themselves. They were using police radios to coordinate drug moves and using marked patrol cars to escort shipments. The scheme worked for years because who were the drug dealers going to complain to? You can't call the police when the police are the ones robbing you. But then came July 28, 1985. A group of officers raided a boat called the Mary C at the Jones Boatyard on the Miami River. They were after 350 kilograms of cocaine. The raid was violent and chaotic. The smugglers on the boat panicked and jumped into the river trying to escape. 3 of them drowned. Unlike previous rips, this one left bodies. Bodies meant a homicide investigation. Homicide detectives who weren't part of the corruption started asking questions. The story began to unravel. The investigation eventually implicated over 100 Miami police officers in various crimes. Nearly 20 were convicted of serious felonies, including murder, racketeering, robbery, and civil rights violations. The betrayal was total. Officers who were supposed to protect the community were preying on it just as much as the criminals they were supposedly fighting. But the corruption wasn't limited to street cops. Operation Court Broom, an FBI sting operation that concluded in the early 1990s, but investigated conduct from the 80s, targeted the Dade County judicial system. They discovered a network where judges were selling bond reductions, suppressing evidence, and appointing specific defense attorneys to lucrative cases in exchange for kickbacks. 4 circuit court judges were indicted. The investigation revealed a pay-to-play system where wealthy drug defendants could basically buy their way out of serious charges. If you had enough money, and the cocaine traffickers certainly did, you could manipulate the entire legal process from arrest through sentencing. Think about what this meant for regular citizens. If you were a black resident of Liberty City arrested for a minor drug charge, you got the full weight of the law. But if you were a cocaine trafficker with millions of dollars, you could bribe judges to reduce your bond, suppress evidence, and get appointed a defense attorney who was in on the scheme. Justice was for sale, and only the rich could afford it. Meanwhile, the federal government was trying to shut down the flow of drugs through Florida. In January 1982, President Reagan created the South Florida Task Force, headed by Vice President George H.W. Bush. They brought together the DEA, FBI, Customs, Coast Guard, IRS, ATF, and local law enforcement in a coordinated effort. By 1986, they could point to impressive statistics. Over 15,000 arrests, more than £6 million of cannabis seized, 100,000 pounds of cocaine seized, hundreds of boats and planes confiscated, money laundering operations disrupted. But here's the actual result. Cocaine imports into the United States increased by 10% during that period. 10%. Despite all the arrests, all the seizures, all the resources poured into the task force. More cocaine was flowing into the country at the end than at the beginning. A Government Accountability Office report stated the obvious. It was doubtful whether the task force can have any substantial long-term impact on drug availability. They were trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. For every plane they shot down, 10 more got through. For every boat they seized, 20 more landed on remote beaches. For every kilo they confiscated, 100 kilos reached the streets. The economics made enforcement almost impossible. A kilo of cocaine that cost $1,500 to produce in Colombia could be sold for $55,000 wholesale in Miami. The profit margins were so enormous that even losing a significant percentage of shipments still left traffickers wildly profitable. The cartels treated seizures as a cost of doing business, like insurance premiums. And the corruption made it worse. When some of the people who are supposed to enforce the law are actually working for the criminals, when judges can be bought, when evidence can be suppressed, the whole system becomes compromised. The honest cops and prosecutors were fighting not just the cartels, but their own colleagues. This created a bizarre situation where Miami in the mid-80s was simultaneously a war zone and a boom town. Murder rates were higher than anywhere else in America, but real estate prices kept climbing. Police corruption was endemic, but construction was everywhere. The medical examiner needed a refrigerated truck for bodies, but tourists kept coming because Miami Vice made it look so cool. The enforcement efforts of the 1980s did eventually have an impact, but not in the way intended. By the late 80s, the cocaine trade had largely moved from South Florida to Mexico. The Mexican cartels took over the distribution networks. The violence in Miami gradually declined, not because the drug war was won, but because the business moved elsewhere. The Miami River Cops scandal led to massive reforms in police hiring and training. The judicial corruption exposed by Operation Court Broom led to new oversight mechanisms, but the fundamental problems, the enormous profit incentives in illegal drugs, the corrosive effect of that money on institutions, the demand for drugs that creates the market in the first place, none of those were solved. Florida in the 1980s proved something important. You can't arrest your way out of a drug problem when the economics make it more profitable to be a criminal than a cop, and when the money is so widespread that it corrupts the very institutions meant to fight it. So what was Florida in the 1980s really like? Not the TV show version, not the tourist brochure, not the selective memory that forgets the hard parts. What was it actually like to live through that decade? The answer is it depended entirely on who you were. If you were a real estate developer or construction company owner, the 1980s were probably the best decade of your life. Money was flowing in faster than you could spend it. Projects that would take years to finance elsewhere got immediate cash backing in Miami. Buildings went up on Brickell Avenue at a pace that wouldn't be matched until the 2000s. You didn't ask too many questions about where the money came from because you knew the answer, and you knew asking would only cause problems. If you were a Cuban refugee who arrived during Mariel, your experience was complicated. You faced initial discrimination and suspicion. You were labelled a criminal even though you weren't. But over time, you built a life. You found work in the construction boom, in restaurants, in businesses throughout Little Havana. Your children went to bilingual schools and grew up straddling two cultures. By the end of the decade, you might have bought a house. The American dream, despite everything, was actually working for you. If you were a black resident of Liberty City or Overtown, the 1980s were a betrayal. You watched cocaine billions flow through your city while your neighbourhoods got none of it. You watched police beat Arthur McDuffie to death and walk free. You watched it happen again with Neville Johnson, again with Clement Lloyd. You watched Cuban refugees get federal assistance you'd never been offered. You watched the highways that cut through your neighbourhood in the 60s remain as economic barriers in the 80s. The riot in 80 was an expression of rage that had been building for decades, and nothing really changed afterward. If you were a gay man in Key West, the 80s started with optimism. You'd helped revitalise the island's economy. You'd elected an openly gay mayor. The community was thriving. Then AIDS arrived, and your friends started dying. You watched the Reagan administration ignore the crisis for years. You organised memorial services that became routine because they were so frequent. You might have been one of the lucky ones who stayed healthy, watching helplessly as people you loved disappeared. Or you might have been one of the 700 who didn't survive the decade. If you were a Haitian refugee, you faced discrimination from every direction. Your government had labelled you an economic migrant, not a political refugee, so you got no assistance. You were detained indefinitely at Chrome while Cuban refugees were released. Then the CDC added Haitians to the 4H's list of AIDS risk groups, and suddenly you couldn't find work because people thought your nationality meant you carried disease. The stigma was overwhelming and it was based on lies, but the damage was real. If you were a tourist visiting Florida in the 80s, you might have had a wonderful time. You went to Disney World, which kept getting bigger and better. You maybe took a day trip to Miami, drove down Ocean Drive, saw the colourful Art Deco buildings that Miami Vice had made famous. You felt like you were somewhere glamorous and exciting. You didn't drive through Liberty City. You didn't know about the AIDS ward at Jackson Memorial Hospital. You experienced the manufactured paradise, and that paradise was real enough for you. If you were a citrus grower in Central Florida, the 80s destroyed your family's legacy. Freezes that you'd always weathered before came so frequently and severely that your trees couldn't recover. Then citrus canker forced you to watch as state workers burned your groves. You held out as long as you could, but eventually you had to sell the land to developers. The groves your grandfather planted became a subdivision. That was heartbreaking in ways that people who didn't grow up in that world couldn't understand. If you were a police officer trying to do your job honestly, the Miami River cop scandal was demoralizing. You risked your life every shift while some of your fellow officers were robbing the criminals you were trying to arrest. You knew who the dirty cops were, but the blue wall of silence made it dangerous to speak up. When the scandal broke, the whole department was painted with the same brush, even though most officers were honest. If you were a middle-class family living in the suburbs, Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, your experience of the 80s might have been relatively normal. You dealt with the recession in the early part of the decade. You watched your money go less far as inflation remained high. Your kids went to school, played sports, watched MTV. You heard about the violence in Miami on the news, but it felt distant. Florida was such a big state that Miami's problems didn't necessarily affect your daily life. If you were elderly and Jewish, retired to South Florida from New York or New Jersey, you found community in places like Century Village. You played cards, went to synagogue, enjoyed the weather, but you also watched as neighborhoods changed dramatically. Miami Beach, which had been 80% Jewish, was transforming. South Beach went from the place where your friends lived to a place you didn't recognize. The cost of living kept rising. Some of your friends were priced out and had to move further north. The paradoxes of Florida in the 1980s were impossible to reconcile. Drug money built skylines while communities burned in racial violence. A TV show created paradise imagery while AIDS decimated whole neighborhoods. Refugees fled tyranny only to face discrimination and systematic mistreatment. Environmental destruction accelerated even as conservation consciousness grew. What daily life actually looked like depended entirely on your circumstances. The cocaine billions touched everything: real estate prices, banking, construction, retail. But the violence fell disproportionately on certain neighborhoods while others remained insulated. The benefits of the economic boom were distributed unequally, usually along lines of race and class that had existed long before the cocaine cowboys arrived. By the end of the decade, some transformation was visible. South Beach had begun its evolution from God's waiting room to international destination. The crack-driven violence was beginning to ebb as the trade shifted to Mexican routes. The Marielitos had integrated far more successfully than anyone predicted in 1980. The AIDS crisis had forced community organization that would prove resilient for decades. But the fundamental inequities remained. Liberty City and Overtown were still suffering from decades of disinvestment. The drug economy had propped up legitimate businesses, but when enforcement finally tightened, those businesses faced a vacuum. Police-community relations remained poisoned by unpunished violence. Environmental degradation continued despite new protections. Here's the final truth about Florida in the 1980s. It was not paradise lost because paradise never existed in the first place. The idea of Florida as paradise has always been manufactured by tourism boards, by developers, by TV shows, by people trying to sell you something. The real Florida has always been messier, more violent, more complex, and ultimately more human than any marketing campaign could capture. The unfiltered reality is that real communities built real lives amid real dangers. Cuban families opened restaurants and sent their children to college. Black activists kept fighting for justice even when the system repeatedly failed them. Gay communities organized to care for the sick when the government wouldn't. Environmental activists like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas kept fighting Big Sugar even when they kept losing. Police officers like Charles Viverka found the courage to tell the truth, even when it meant betraying the blue wall of silence. Florida in the 1980s was a decade when a state became a symbol, for better and worse, of American excess, reinvention, and contradiction. It was the decade that proved you could build paradise on blood money, at least for a while. That you could manufacture an image so powerful it obscured the reality beneath. That the American dream and the American nightmare could occupy the same streets, sometimes the same buildings. The Miami you remember from the 80s probably isn't the Miami that actually existed. It's the Miami that Miami Vice showed you, the one that existed on your TV screen. But the real Miami, where refugees were detained indefinitely, where communities erupted in righteous rage, where the violence was as real as the neon lights were artificial, that Miami was more interesting, more tragic, and more important than the manufactured version. And that real Miami, that unfiltered Florida, shaped everything that came after. The demographics of modern Florida, the tri-ethnic reality of Miami, the Latin American influence that permeates the culture, that came from the 80s. The economic model of South Florida as an international financial center built on a foundation that included cocaine billions. The preservation of Art Deco architecture that makes South Beach distinctive, that came from a TV show's production design. The environmental restoration efforts in the Everglades, born from the degradation that reached crisis levels in the 80s. The 1980s didn't just change Florida, they broke the old Florida and built a new, volatile, and vibrant reality in its place. Understanding that reality, the actual history, not the sanitized version, helps explain the Florida that exists today. The inequalities, the cultural richness, the environmental challenges, the complexity of immigration, the relationship between image and reality, all of these threads lead back to that singular decade when everything changed. That's the unfiltered reality of Florida in the 1980s. Not paradise, not dystopia. Just the complicated, contradictory, violent, beautiful truth of a place and a time when the American experiment was tested in ways that revealed both its greatest strengths and its deepest failures.